We're seeing an increased number in DEI searches at Fraser Jones. Do you feel like organizations are starting to make progress?
We are seeing a lot of focus and spend, probably more across sectors that have more money to spend on it. And then I think the industries that don't have a lot of budget for it are trying to do other things like training and development to make that progress. And in different parts of the world, it's so different. In Australia, we're seeing a huge focus on Indigenous hiring, and I'm sure in the US with Black Lives Matter, you're seeing a lot of focus in that space as well.
And I think what's interesting as well is we're seeing an increased number of specialized DEI roles. So we have dedicated DEI talent acquisition partners now, which you never saw 5 years ago.
Yeah. And I think to make the progress, it's hard when the market compresses from a budgetary perspective because the focus then starts to move to other things. But I think what organisations do, especially if they don't have budget, is they become more transparent. They acknowledge where they are. They acknowledge also and explain where they want to go. I think from a recruitment perspective, that's really helpful because people want that honesty. And I think, we have to sort of respect where they are, even if it may not be where they want to be, and just help them on that journey.
Yeah. And I think you struck on a really important point there in that sometimes the transparency is more important to employees than the awards or the recognition. I think employees want to know that companies recognize where they are and how far they still need to go.
And they can throw statistics at you, but how meaningful is it? So, yeah. Over time, and maybe more recently, have you felt that what diversity means to an organisation has changed?
I think companies' understanding of the positive impact that DEI can have on an organization's performance and bottom line has increased, which is obviously critical. I think particularly in the US, there's an increased focus at the moment on transgender rights, certainly in the news a lot lately. I think there is always a resistance when you're trying to make that progress. And I think as we push forward harder, I feel like there's some pushback. So I think there's a better understanding from organizations, but there's still such a long way for us to go. But they understand the commercial value in increasing diversity and obviously advancing inclusion in organizations as well.
When you're hiring, do clients or candidates really push the diversity agenda, or do you have to drive it? Because in Australia, the clients aren't driving the conversation. On a day-to-day, people higher up the chain might be talking about it, but lower down, everybody's just so focused on delivery that it doesn't come up very often. And I think that is our responsibility now to try and have those more difficult conversations. And the people that we're talking to may not know all the answers, but they need to go and get them for us to be able to talk to the candidates about.
I think there's a desire for organizations to do something, and sometimes it can be something really small that makes a big difference. Making sure that we have a diverse panel when we're interviewing candidates is really critical, but you don't see a lot of organizations fully embracing something so simple, which can have such a huge impact, whether it's removing names from a resume or the names of colleges from resumes and CVs. That's something that can help. I think there's mixed results from studies, but there's small things that organizations can do to start making a difference. I think the biggest things, diversity training doesn't tend to have a longer term impact. I think organizations last year in the US spent about $8 billion on diversity training. And you fast forward 6 or 12 months and the impact just completely drops off. Things like mentorship programs or actually hiring a dedicated diversity lead or establishing an internal diversity task force, these things actually drive real impact and also engagement and inclusion in the organization as well.
In the recruitment process, we see, and especially in Australia, a lot of focus just on gender. And I think that needs to shift. In the US, what's happening to make that shift sort of speed up a little bit? Like, could we learn anything from what the US are doing to shift the focus away from gender onto other minority groups?
Yeah, I think it's also defining what diversity means for an organization. So sometimes gender isn't the focus. It could be a fairly well-balanced organization. I think organizations need to define what diversity means specifically for them or certain divisions within the business. Sometimes it's ethnic diversity. Sometimes it's diversity of thought. Where are people graduating from a college perspective? it's great if you have diversity, but if everyone graduated from Harvard, you don't really have diversity in your business.
Yeah.
So I think it's taking that first step of establishing what diversity means for the business. And then not just focusing on diversity statistics, because that's a very easy black and white metric that organizations like to use, but really focusing on making sure they have an inclusive environment first. Because if you try to drive diverse hiring, but you're not retaining that diverse talent because it's not an inclusive environment, then it's really a fruitless task.
Yeah.
So you're obviously helping organizations hire people. That's our job. How do you help them to create diverse shortlists? How do you go about that?
So the starting point is making sure that we're writing our adverts and putting them in places where a diverse range of people will see them, but not only that, apply for them. We obviously also go out and find those people as well. So we've been proactive and reactive. But some people aren't describing their experience correctly online, or when you look at their LinkedIn profile, they might have missed out some key information for whatever reason. So what we do is, if we're not sure, we find out. Whereas I think a lot of busy people will just put it in the too hard basket and move on. And then, so we make sure our adverts are inclusive. And then when the ad response starts coming in, I've encouraged my team so much, as much as they can anyway, to always pick up the phone and have a chat to people. If they think, if they're not sure, you always call. That's the rule. And I think that's the hardest thing for internal people when they've got a lot of vacancies on and they don't have the time to necessarily do that. I think that's the biggest impact we can make, because there's a lot of things that a lot of people put a lot of weight on a CV, the way it's written, the way it's formatted. And I think even recruiters are the worst people at writing their own CVs. So we try to focus on that. And then when you look at the next level of, okay, so when people apply, what happens then? And AI is playing such a big role in the recruitment process. And it's great, it's a great tool. But, you know, for example, on LinkedIn, when we post the job, it'll say auto archive candidates out of country. And it's really tempting to press yes, because I don't want to be dealing with applicants from overseas. But my argument is that what happens if that person is returning? What happens if, you know, they're not sure, they just need a little bit more information, they can get a visa, you know, and it's very tempting to press the button to save you time. And I think that's where you have to take a step back and say, well, actually, that's not helping anything. I need to look at everyone in the talent pool who's interested. And then when you get to the next stage, how do I represent people? And I think I love LinkedIn as a format because it's the same for everyone, whether people choose or not to have a photo, but it's uniform. And if I'm struggling with a CV because it's not written very well, I'll go to LinkedIn. I don't give up, you go to LinkedIn. And then when we talk about, you know, how do we represent them to the client, like you mentioned earlier, taking names off of CVs, making things a little bit more generic, maybe with education. But again, it's, you know, we have to consult with what the client needs to see. And I think the clients want things uniform as well. So what you do for one client may not be right for the other, but as long as you're doing it all the same for all the same candidates. And also, I think now with the change of how we work, there's not as much face-to-face happening, and some candidates don't want to meet you face-to-face. And we have to make a decision with the client about, what does this process look like? Like, are you comfortable for this to be all online? Or and then you've got to make adjustments for people, because if you have, we have candidates who will drop out of testing because it's 3 hours long. That's not an inclusive piece of recruitment, but it's necessary. So, you know, it's just it's trying to make sure you've asked all the right questions up front, and then making it as equitable and inclusive for all different types of people and how they may need to interview.
So it's interesting, I think, when you look at bias within an interview process, and two things that tend to be very biased are the number of years of experience and the college or university that they attended. And those are two things that really make up a resume. So I think people are judged on that piece of paper, where in study, a structured interview and a work sample are actually far better indicators of whether somebody's right for a job or not. And I think that's where we're expected to already add value in the process and remove that bias because we're able to invest more time. We have an established network and we can conduct more detailed interviews just because we're specialized, and it allows us to assess candidates on that basis rather than just judging them on the paper and that initial application. As we look ahead, I think as we push forward, you're bound to receive more pushback. And it's that consistency of application that's really going to drive change and investing in the right places. I think there's more pressure on DEI leaders to demonstrate a return on investment. And this is really the time where what they do is going to be measured and they're going to be tested on that impact.